Thank, thank you so much. I am going to attempt to share slides, which is always a challenge for me. Let's see, make this presenter view.
Yep, looks
Okay,
great.
can you see that? Okay, great.
Perfect. Yep.
Um, so thanks again so much, Sarah, for having me here. I have been in this space in former roles, and I'm really grateful to be in this space again in a different role at CSH. So, a little bit about me. My name is Sydney Pop Richardson, and I'm a senior program manager at the Corporation for Supportive Housing. I am based in New York City, and currently work on some portfolios around aging, as well as the high acuity needs of supportive housing tenants, reentry, and opioid overdose prevention. But the reason I'm here today is I think that, aging is a justice issue, and it's particularly true when we think about aging in affordable or supportive housing, around things like mental health, PTSD, substance use, crisis intervention, collective trauma, financial insecurity. And I've seen this a lot throughout my career. I started my career as a HIV and housing case manager in Chicago, as well as LA, working with unhoused folks. And in New York City, have done a range of things around housing. My last position was at Sage, and as the lead on the Sage's National LGBTQ plus Elder Housing Initiative. So looking at all of these intersections around aging is something that I'm really passionate about and would love to hear from folks as we go through this. So just for context, if you don't know who CSH is, the Corporation for Supportive Housing is a national organization. We are a lender, so we're a CDFI, but we also collaborate with community organizations across the country and locally to advance housing solutions around homelessness, to improve the lives of the most marginalized communities, maximize public resources, and build healthy communities by strengthening access to housing and supportive housing. Um, and so today we're just going to talk a little bit about like foundational frameworks of aging and the intersections that we see in supportive housing, as well as some practical tools around our healthy aging toolkit in supportive housing and some models that might be helpful to you. And then after talking also about design, I want to open it up for discussion because I know that there's a lot of knowledge in this room as well. So we're here to talk about ways that folks can age well in supportive housing, and community services that allow them to thrive. I think a lot about the very beginning of my career in HIV case management, which was now about 2 decades ago, thinking about how people living with and dying from HIV could stay in their homes, and how that kind of disability justice and aging justice is something we can learn from in terms of models from the past as we think about innovations moving forward. Um, this also means having well-trained staff. It means well-resourced staff because we know burnout is huge, and an understanding of the kind of baseline aging needs that people are presenting in supportive housing and in all housing, really. Um, and I know that this is probably common knowledge in a review, but just to get us all on the same page when we're talking about healthy aging, it's important to optimize opportunities and not just focus on deficits of someone, right? So it means optimizing opportunities for physical, social, mental wellness, independence, quality of life, and successful life transitions. And that means thinking about a holistic approach to aging. So um, when we think about healthy aging and affordable and supportive housing, it means centering emotional wellness through interventions like peer counseling, stress management, humor, laughter, honoring people's dignity and their choice. We think about intellectual and cognitive wellness through creativity and intellectually stimulating activities like courses, journaling, crosswords, painting, puzzles, socialization. We think about physical wellness in terms of maintaining someone's physical independence and their ability to live independently as much so as possible. And this means adequate nutrition, hydration, sleep, and also the connection between psychosocial and physical health. Um, we think about things like vocational wellness. A lot of aging folks we see are still working well past the age of 62. And so, what does vocational wellness and support look like? Or how are people's hobbies and support that they need for a huge life transition of not working be supported in supportive housing or in affordable housing? We think about social wellness, peers, families, chosen family networks, and as well as spiritual wellness and environmental wellness around things like opportunities to bring natural environments into a lived space. So thinking about property design, location, walking paths. We know that horticultural therapy is something that some supportive housing providers are working with, and it can be incredibly therapeutic from both like a mental health PTSD intervention, as well like an occupational therapy intervention, as well as just engaging people on things that they're interested in. So I'm sure that we've all had these conversations, but ageism is real and it's something that um, we're talking about more, but like we historically have not. We know that globally, 1 in 2 people are ageist against older people, and there are really material impacts of ageism on communities. Excuse me. We see lower life expectancies when people experience ageism. And older people with positive views of aging tend to perform better on hearing tests, on memory tests, and are less likely to develop more exacerbated psychiatric illnesses as they age. We also see the impact on things like cardiovascular events, heart failure, stroke, physical function. And there's a lot of studies to emphasize that. And so it's important to think about the impact similar to all of the isms, right? And how that impacts someone's holistic health and their wellness, especially as they age. So we've all internalized ageism due to the world we were raised. And the first step is really looking at some examples, refusal to hire, excuse me, I'm getting over a cold, so apologies. Um, invisibilizing people, treating someone like they are a child, infantilizing them. A common way that we call like benevolent ageism manifests in healthcare is through baby talk, which involves just talking to someone like they're a child, using oversimplified language, terms of endearment, a rhythmic tone, as you would to a kid. Um, and while people often use this as an attempt to communicate more effectively, it can be patronizing and reinforce unequal power dynamics. So it's important to think about these types of things. We also, um, I mentioned that my former work was at Sage looking at LGBTQ plus aging. As with many communities that have experienced kind of collective discrimination, we see exacerbated aging in different groups. And so we see barriers to aging well, like the oppression and visibility that LGBTQ folks have experienced throughout their lifetime. They might not always feel safe in shelter or in medical settings, which can cause people to fall through the cracks. It can cause medical concerns to be really compounded as they age if they've been unaddressed because of treatment they've had in the past, medical or social service settings, and the challenges that people face around family of origin rejection, discrimination in housing and care settings, disproportionate levels of poverty, and barriers to economic security, and historical financial instability that can cause more vulnerability and increased isolation. We know that historically, nursing homes hospice care and other aging services don't have a history of addressing this community specific needs. But we know that this is particularly exacerbated for LGBTQ folks who are Black, who are Indigenous, and other queer folks of color as well. And so thinking about intersectionality and the impact of racism on aging, the impact of being unhoused chronically on aging, um, the intersecting isms impact how we treat tenants and how we advocate for tenants. So promoting age-friendly workplaces helps increase satisfaction and retention for staff and for tenants, where an environment feels safe for all communities. It helps cultivate a safer work environment too for the staff. And again, historically oppressed communities are often more impacted by ageism. We have studies that are coming out that show um, more increased rates of dementia or cognitive decline in groups who have historically experienced systemic harm and oppression. And so that shows the clear connection between discrimination and how we can age or age well and age in a healthy way. Um, so, I think that like this is probably a conversation that y'all have had, but just some ways to combat ageism. Think about being more aware of it. How does it shape the way we think and feel and talk to people? Learn how ageism affects people by listening to people's stories. Elders have so much to share, and um, in clinicalized or even in housing settings, that wealth of life experience is not always seen or heard. So, in programming, providing space for people to share who they are and what they bring to the community, and to have social supports around that as well. And then, taking action, correcting stereotypes, challenging jokes, and speaking out against discrimination. And this is something we can do around many forms of discrimination. But particularly when we're talking about aging and housing, the kind of invisibilization that happens of older adults, we stand in a point to be able to combat that. Also, just some key statistics to frame our discussion when trying to understand and serve populations. Mental health and well-being are as important in older age as they are in any other time of life. Mental and neurological disorders among older adults account for 6.6 of the total disability for this age group, and approximately 15% of folks over 60 suffer from some form of mental illness. And we also know that isolation, which is objective, which means separation from people, community, resources, and then loneliness, which is subjective, is the feelings of being alone or separated from a network or support or social connections, really exacerbate mental health challenges when people age. And loneliness and isolation, again, pose health risks which increase in acuity for people as they age. We also are seeing a large and increasing number of older adults dealing with substance use, which looks like higher hospitalization rates and healthcare expenses. Physiological changes with aging also put older folks just in a different position to have adverse outcomes, including diminished liver function, which impacts um, the effects of substances, and exacerbated for folks living with illnesses such as Hep C. And prescribed medications can also lead to adverse effects with alcohol or other substances. So, something that is really important when we're looking at substance use and aging is really trying to delineate, is this substances? Is this something cognitive that is happening? Is this the combination of substances and something physiological? Or are we assuming that someone is using substances when actually there might be some um, dementia or cognitive delay happening? um, on that note, dementia is not a quote, natural part of the aging process, but depression and early stage dementia can mimic symptoms at times. And so the onset of dementia can exacerbate mental health conditions. Um, Mental health issues also remain a predictor of potential dementia later in life. So, successfully addressing mental health conditions can help reduce the likelihood of dementia later in life. Um, and there are misconceptions, which I'm not going to dive too deep into, about cognitive decline in older adults. We should expect someone who is frail or older patients to get confused at times, right? Especially after receiving pain medication. Our bodies process medications differently as we age. Um, and the sudden onset of cognitive problems is characteristics of common forms of dementia, but again, it could be something else like medication or illness. So, um, thinking about also what can someone do with dementia, right? Early diagnosis of dementia does not generally improve quality of life for people experiencing the condition, but it is key in getting help and mitigating future illnesses. Um, and, dementia does not signal the end of a person's ability to carry out their daily activities or to have a meaningful life necessarily. And so many people with a diagnosis lead active, meaningful lives. And some people fear that if a doctor diagnoses them with dementia, they'll no longer be able to go for a walk alone, or they'll have to stop driving their vehicle immediately. And it is true that some adjustments need to be made, but in mild cases of dementia, this might not be necessary. Um, and so I'm going to save this until the discussion piece, but just thinking, are there strategies that you all have used to communicate and support people living with dementia or cognitive decline? And what have those been? Um, Things like music therapy, for example, can be really incredible programming. It's not always funded, but music therapy, art therapy can be really incredible in terms of uh, speaking to memory and just bringing about ease for people that are having confusion or are agitated in dementia. And so there are kinds of interventions that can be really healing too. Um, and then just thinking about working with folks with difficulties. So speaking to someone directly, following up for understanding and communication, monitoring nonverbal communication, and thinking about what are the other ways that people communicate. Are there post-it notes that are helpful put to write things down, to write reminders? I do that around my house already. Focusing on short-term goals, giving instructions one step at a time, making checklists, reminder sheets, and initiating interactions. It's the social component of this is still so critically important. Maximize potential, minimize distractions, and again, writing it down. Um, And accessibility considerations are also so critically important. It means making information, activities, and an environment usable, sensible for as many people as possible. And I would argue that cultivating care and access and support for people with disabilities so they have an environment just not just to survive, but to thrive. And these are some examples of accessibility, right? So visually large fonts, high contrast, mobility support, ambulation support, auditory support, written materials, closed captioning, TV listening systems, and appliances like jar openers or weighted pens. Um, Disability access also means cultivating a supportive environment for people with chronic health conditions and providing support around various mental health needs. So it's important in aging spaces to offer accessibility options as a standard baseline practice while also listening to what a tenant needs. Um, and again, I would ask you to think a little bit about what are some accessibility innovations either in supportive housing or in your respective work or lives um, that have been helpful for you or for your family or for the folks that you work with. Um, Before we start our discussion, I'm going to talk a little bit about some practical tools that CSH has developed. And this is meant to be, we talk about like barriers a lot. We talk about what are the needs, but then like what are some practical things and strategies that we can use to make our work better. And so to provide more practical tools, CSH has developed this toolkit on meeting the needs of older tenants in supportive housing. And also, even if you are not in supportive housing, these are really wonderful tools for a wide array of folks working with older adults in different care settings. We interviewed staff at all levels of different agencies. We interviewed older adults in supportive housing, and we learned how programs were responding to the aging needs that they were seeing with older adults and where there were significant gaps. One of the biggest concerns that we heard from people was not knowing how to address higher levels of need with older adults, right? So, for example, in supportive housing, there is generally the requirement that someone is able to live independently if they have like the supports in place that are needed, right? But whereas that kind of gap in between um, living independently, alone, potentially in a supportive housing environment, and needing a higher level of care, but really not a nursing home level of care. So we've also been thinking a lot about like how can we kind of tier the levels of need in supportive housing or provide more robust services for people to be able to age in place. So this toolkit is both educational and practical. Um, and these are some of the sections that it includes: key concepts and guiding principles for supporting folks, um, meeting the needs of older residents in supportive housing, and staffing models and enhanced training, as well as thinking about the resources for the aging population and what is a higher level of care and how do you know when someone needs a higher level of care. Also, end of life care and transitions. We hosted a really wonderful discussion with a former colleague and a death doula, Hannah Yore, around the kind of stigma around talking about end of life planning, whether it be financial, logistical, um, or a really trauma informed and affirming way to talk about what it means to plan for death in a way that can feel scary to some people, but also um, making it really intentional about what are your needs and what is a living will and what are the things that you want your family to know or your chosen family to know or do when you eventually pass. So those kinds of transitions. And then sample policies, procedures, and templates. So I do want to highlight this section, which can be really helpful for folks across the board. Policies, procedures, and templates to help you operationalize this work. So we have templates around an aging in place policy. Do you have an aging in place policy? An assessment procedure. So how do you assess the needs and kind of where someone is at? Navigating cognitive decline and dementia, responding to a tenant death, and housing and services plan. Um, so I'm going to go over just a little bit about some of the tenets of our aging in place policy that you can utilize at your respective organizations. So it starts with defining an organization's purpose and commitment to supporting aging tenants over time. Principles such as the promotion of well-being, dignity, independence, and choice can be really articulated here. Next, outline your scope. What does this policy apply to? Who does it apply to? How is it applied? And what are the responsibilities? You can lay out definitions like what does an assessment mean? What is a service plan? And you can name guiding principles or values such as respect, safety, dignity. Outline important relevant procedures such as family member reports, incident reports, identifying changing needs, reasonable accommodation procedures, monitoring, and more. And next, it's important to outline roles and responsibilities of staffing. And so, what's the role of the case manager, the service coordinator, maintenance staff, property management, social workers? Um, and it's also important to think about limitations and indicators and procedures for tenants transition planning when someone does need a higher level of care, and what is the level of care that you're prepared to provide, or bring in external support around. What capacities do staff have to address high acuity needs of aging tenants? An aging place policy should also outline confidentiality expectations as well as the organization's grievance procedure. And then another sample procedure I'll just go over quickly is outlined in our toolkit is a sample assessment procedure. And an assessment procedure for tenants aging in supportive housing should really start with naming the purpose of the assessment. So this is a sample goal to ensure the comprehensive assessment of aging tenants age 55 and over at intake and following critical incidents to identify potential needs relating to cognition, functional abilities, fall risk, and social connectedness, and to facilitate timely and appropriate referrals and support. The assessment procedure also includes applicability assessment tools, responsibility. So, what are the responsibilities of various roles? What's the responsibilities of the agency? Procedural steps, post critical incident assessments, workflow based on assessment results, ADLs, fall risk, social isolation, loneliness, and documentation processes. So that's a little bit about our toolkit. It's only a few snippets, although I talked a lot about it, and I'm happy to share in our follow-up the link to the toolkit. And then I just want to talk a little bit about like design considerations. So what are some things to think about in design? Aging in place is a community space issue. And so what does your senior center look like? What is the lighting of the place? Is it well lit, but also in a trauma-informed way, not hyper-fluorescent, like an institutional setting like prison or hospitals, et cetera. What are the colors on the walls? In the uh, apartments or even in public settings, are there emergency alerts? Are there, if you do have kind of external horticulture therapy, for example, do you have terraced garden beds? So are the garden beds raised or are they on the ground where people might not necessarily be able to bend over? You think about brick and doorway design, plumbing that might be specific to the needs of older adults. Thinking about the infrastructure of restrooms. Are there restrooms on the ground floor near the lobby if people are waiting for Access-a-Ride? Is there a restroom available near a laundry room? Think about chair size, fabric, the lobby size and seating. Is there a communal kitchen? And inside, again, the apartments, are there fall risks? Stairs are often not the best model for aging in place. Shower bars and seats. Think about things like the kitchen sink ledge. Is it so thin that someone might, we saw this in an apartment building that I was a part of years ago. Does it pool water because the ledge is too thin? And then that's a huge fall risk, right, from leaking water on the kitchen floor. And think about unit size and downsizing. One of the hardest things for folks that might be moving into supportive housing later in life is how much are they downsizing and how traumatic that can be. Like there's the physical infrastructure of what's possible, right? But instead of studios, can you have one bedrooms or can you have two bedrooms because people have chosen family or grandchildren or family or supports that need to be able to stay in the home. And then thinking about community and external geography, how can people engage with their local community? Is there fresh food access? Is there a grocery store? What are the transportation needs of someone I was working with a supportive housing development in the Bronx, and it was very relatively walking distance, 5-minute walk from the subway, which, on paper was great. But the Bronx, for anyone that might know, can be very hilly. And it was on the top of this hill, and most of the aging residents were not able to use the subway directly because they couldn't go up and down the hill with ease. And so there was a sense of isolation or having to rely on things like Accessoride or um, other transportation options that were not the subway. So thinking about details like that in a space is really important. Um, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and feel like I was just talking a bunch and wanted to open it up to discussion or for people to share. Um, Sorry, now I'm trying to figure out how to stop sharing. There we go. I was not able to see the chat, so I wanted people to be able to talk a little bit about some things and interventions, whether it's around tools that have felt helpful for you in your work or barriers that you have seen, or open it up for questions as well and conversation, because I know there's a lot of experts in the room too. And I need to stop talking for a sec.
Yes, grab a drink of water. Thank you so much for just such a great presentation. Definitely to get our minds turning and hope to take some ideas back to the teams. There were no questions in the chat, but sometimes this can be a talkative bunch. So I'm curious to see what everyone has to say. Any thoughts? Yeah, I would love to hear about those barriers too. I think that's really important to discuss in a group like this. So. Anyone able to unmute? Yeah, go ahead and unmute. Thanks for raising your hand. Yep.
Yeah, so hey there, I'm Tara. You guys came to McCullough, I think it was last year to do a training, and I think I was looking for in this training like what I brought up the last time when I gave you guys feedback about ageism being reversed, like with older adults. Um, like performing the ageism on staff or like somebody that's helping them, right? Like, for example, I'm younger than the older adults, so they might not want to work with me. Do you guys remember that feedback that I gave you? So I kind of was looking for a little touch of that in here. My favorite part of the presentation, though, was the highlight on the LGBT older adult community. Just because we just don't have a lot of education that's being like dispersed to service providers. So I can really appreciate that part. But I just thought I'd mention that reverse ageism too, because that's also important for service workers to be educated on, just like maybe touch on and express. But overall, I thought it was a great presentation.
Thank you, Tara. That's really helpful. I didn't mention, I don't think I was the presenter, but if I was, apologies. I started at CSH in October. This is my first housing happenings since I started in this role, although I did a housing happenings, I think, a few years back with Sage.
Mm.
But this is so real, and ageism happens absolutely across the board, and that can be another piece of that is like educating tenants or the elders on what are um, and we see this right with ageism, we see it with racism, we see it with many isms, right? Like educating tenants on what is appropriate behavior. And that's actually something that could be a part of the kinds of tools that you develop around how do we protect staff and how do we have sometimes hard conversations with tenants around their behavior and how they are engaging. What are the standards that are expected? And how can we also have like educational opportunities from the administration with tenants or with older adults around uh, this is not appropriate and here's why if you don't understand why. And so
Yeah.
not necessarily even having a punitive approach, but being like, listen, this is something that we need to talk about and ongoing education with tenants as well. So I really appreciate that feedback. And I think it's absolutely real and very important.
Yeah, thank you, Sydney.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Anyone else? Questions, comments, concerns, celebrations, or grievances? Would love to hear about those if there's any barriers as well.
I think
I
there's
will
some things in the
say, oh,
chat. I'm sorry, I was just saying, like, I think people are putting things in the chat.
I haven't seen any questions, but let me go through again. If you're putting a question in the chat and not unmuting, just be careful that you're not doing it to anyone in the waiting room. I know that's happened in the past before. Um,
I was just gonna say something we hear from a lot of supportive housing providers is like, you know, we feel like we have the skills to deal with like complex needs and working with unhoused people, but the unhoused population is aging. And there, I don't have the stats in front of me, but I was just at the National Alliance to End Homelessness conference, and the stats around like the majority of unhoused folks being people who are over 50 is huge. And so, um, you know, we folks don't always feel like they have adequate support or resources to address both like the high complex needs of people who have been historically unhoused or are dealing with chronic mental health stuff, as well as aging in those intersections. And I'm wondering if other folks are experiencing that, or if there seems to be a separation and a flattening of what aging means. But aging is all of these things, and staff just don't always have the support, right?
yeah. We did have somebody just caught. My building has a bullying issue, which we've been working on and is coming a long ways. What would you recommend for residents are not receptive to education?
Hmm. I think that, I mean, this is something that I often talked about around working with LGBTQ plus tenants is not everyone is going to like jump on board, right? And so sometimes it is the kind of education, meeting people where they are at and understanding that not everyone is going to shift their beliefs or how they feel about certain communities, unfortunately. But you still have a standard of behavior. And I think having protocols and community agreements and behavioral expectations in place, it's not going to solve everything, but it's something to point to say, so one of our community expectations is that we are, for example, an anti-racist agency. And so racism of any kind is not accepted. Um, and it can, that's one example, but if folks are bullying, sometimes it's bullying based on, just social stuff and the dynamics that kind of show up in any kind of social space, but really making it clear around behavioral expectations for not just staff, but for tenants. This is the community and the culture of the community that we are building. And having those established guidelines can help to be something to point back to. And I
Great.
think someone actually put the toolkit in the chat. And if you did, thank you.
Yeah. Yep. That resource is great. Yeah, and if you have a resource, folks on the call today, please put those in the chat as well because they're just helpful just for our shared learning together. Great. Any other questions or challenges that folks wanted to raise today?
Hi, hello.
Hi.
I
Hi.
almost typed it, but it would be too confusing, so I just did it.
That's okay. Unmute.
Um,
Yep.
so I appreciate everything that you share, Sydney. We are this. I'm from Princeton Community Housing, so how the outside perceives us is how we're not. We're not supportive housing, but the type of service that we provide are very close to that, and people tend to expect way more than we can provide. We have four different properties, different dynamic in terms of the population. And we often come to that, confusion from people. Oh, but aren't you the social worker? Didn't you do this? Didn't you do that? And it's so hard to deal with those comments and questions because we do try. Our job is to help the residents age in place as independent as possible, save, and connect them to the resources in the community to deal with those, different types of needs. Every time I join these type of meetings, I bring that up just to hear what other people's thoughts are about that.
I don't know if anyone else has thoughts, feel free to jump in, but I think that that is hard because I think you want to provide the services that you can provide to your capacity, and also um, it might be helpful internally to just have some talking points around what are we not and what can we not do. And when we can't do that, real clarity on what is the level of care that we have capacity to do, because if you're going beyond your capacity, you're straining staff. People are not trained, like people are not prepared to deal with a wide array of things that might be coming up. And so, something that I'm sure that you do, but we always suggest is like some community mapping. So, what are some of the kinds of needs that are coming up in your building or your residences that you might not be prepared to address, and what are the resources in the surrounding community, and how can you make those kinds of relationships strong and points of connection? And then how can you be clear, whether it's with the community or with new people moving in, like this is what we can do, but here's what we cannot. Not to approach it again from a deficit, but just a reality around the parameters and boundaries around what your work is, so that people are clear and expectations are clear. A lot of that is really just like messaging and making sure that you can have those conversations that are clear. I know that doesn't fully answer your question, but
Helpful.
just
Thank you.
clarity. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Sydney. Question in the chat. What is your best supports and resources for those with mental health challenges? Thoughts around that. I know that that's is a big topic.
Yeah. And, it shows up sometimes when people are aging, like more strongly. It depends on where you're at. If you're, again, I can't emphasize enough this kind of like resource mapping. So, like, what are kind of doing an assessment of what are the mental health needs that are coming up for the folks you work with. What are the needs and where are the gaps that you can't fill those needs? And then what exists externally if it can't happen in-house? So, we're working, for example, on a high acuity project where we're working with some pilot programs in New York City that are developing new interventions to more um, with funding, pilot funding, to address the complex mental and physiological needs that people are experiencing in supportive housing when there's just not enough resources. So hiring new staff, new nursing, new social worker, new OT. But if you can't do that, and clearly it's not in your role, it really is about mapping what is available. So what are the community health clinics? Are what are the aging spaces, and what kinds of referrals can be made from those types of spacing around like therapy, individual therapy? What are the resources that people have? Like if people still have some form of private insurance and Medicare, maybe they can pay for um, individual therapy, but a lot of folks cannot. And so, what are the community resources in terms of community health, mental health clinics? Um, like senior centers, external senior centers, and other mental health resources that accept Medicare and or Medicaid. Really kind of just mapping out what exists in the community to address mental health. And also thinking again about cultural competency. Are these places that work with people who are aging? Are these places that work with diverse communities? And what are their kind of mission statements on their websites that are clear about like anti-discrimination, things like that? So I would say really just kind of mapping what's around you is a really good start.
Mhm. I have a question as a follow-up to what you just discussed. Uh, when you provide the resources that you just described, and the individual is not able to maintain themselves independently. They provided home health aid and so forth, but then on the weekends where they're left to their own resources, it's just not doable for them. And there's no family involvement whatsoever. At what point would one, involve adult protective services, or would you involve adult protective services?
Yeah, um that is a hard question because I
Yeah.
can't make that assessment for you, but I think the goal, right, like is through the week, if they have support that they can maintain their housing and everything is cool, great. But if there are days of the week that they don't have that support and they cannot maintain their independence in some way. I do think that is a question. Like I'm not eager to jump to APS, but I do think that you can engage them and call and say, listen, this is what's going on. What resources are available for this person, or do we really need to get them into a higher level of care?
Yeah.
Calling is not necessarily going to make that decision, but they also have the resources to do sophisticated assessments of someone's safety, right? Because it's also you're in some ways responsible for their safety, and if they can't
Hmm.
be safe, that will be a problem for everyone. So that's a really hard call to make, though, because I wish that if people could have round the clock support, that's one thing. But if they can't, um, then they might be posing a risk to themselves, and that is an assessment that APS.
Hmm. Okay. Thank you.
I see completing assessment as if it's their worst or a very bad day could be helpful. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Well, great questions and engagement. I know we have about 7 minutes left, so I don't want to cut us short, but do we have anyone else? Okay, well, Sydney, any final thoughts that you have for us today? Anything that you haven't said that you would like to say? Any last takeaways?
I just am grateful to be in this space with you all. And I think, like I said, aging is a justice issue and it's connected to all the other parts of our identities. And I think that complexity can also show up in complex ways when we age. And so I am happy to have conversations offline with people and can again, we share the toolkit, but happy to share more materials and trainings as they come up and always welcome questions on the work that CSH is doing more broadly as well. So I'll put my email here and thank you so much for having me. It's really, really great space.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time with us today. So, yeah, and thanks for putting your email there in the chat. I'll leave the Zoom open just for a few minutes so folks can copy that if they want to email you directly. But I hope everybody has a great rest of the day and look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, folks.